My name is Joshua Bastian Cole. I go by Cole. I'm 32 years old. I live in Brooklyn, New York. I'm a queer playwright, dramaturg, theater and dance historian, classical revisionist, and I'm also a female-to-male transsexual. And I am a part of LGBTQQIA history because I can say out loud that I am a female-to-male transsexual. I had the resources and the technological abilities of the age to transition physically. And I am part of the generation of trans men who came out on the internet, which I think is a very historically relevant part of my identity. Prior to the existence of things like chat rooms and listservs and groups and things like that, I think it was very difficult for a lot of folks to find community. It certainly was the case for me, that I didn't have a lot of support in my immediate vicinity in terms of my peers or family members at the time, and I gained the most support through other folks that I found across the country and the world. Of course, now there are much stronger local communities now that transgender is a more recognized identity. At the time, it was very difficult to even find anyone who knew what it meant or had ever even heard of the word, even though it was already part of the LGBT. The T was desperately lacking in terms of representation or even discussion amongst the queer communities that I was surrounded by at the time. A lot of trans people found the ability to find true selves through the avenue of creating personas and avatars on the internet. You can really be whoever you wanted to be. When I was coming out, people were starting to assume that because of having an identity on the internet, it equals a deviance or a perversion and a lie. But I think what makes me an activist is that I have always put myself out there just to be visible and present as somebody who is a trans person and has a life that doesn't revolve necessarily just on that fact. I've tried to emphasize that trans people are also people who do other things and are emotionally healthy, or at least as much as anyone else is, and can be happy and successful people. I've also made myself a visible presence because when I was trying to find other trans people, it was really hard to find information that wasn't very pathological. I was just looking for people who were people and could talk about things as if it wasn't a humongous burden, because I don't see it that way. And I've always felt pride around it because in discovering this truth about myself, it was very liberating, and it made me very happy when I was unhappy prior to coming out as trans, because the confusion was about not knowing that trans was a possibility, which is the opposite of how people, non-trans and non-queer people, consider gender confusion a bad thing and a sickness. my confusion was that I didn't know that I was trans, or that it existed. Yeah, on that, I don't like to talk about coming out a lot because I think that is kind of boring, honestly. It's really interesting to people who have not had to come out, and I sort of never really understood why we have to, other than it's this epiphany of, it's this revelation of truth, which is amazing, and it's great to share. But it's just, in terms of the question of how would my life be different had I learned about queer people at a younger age, I would have, it would have been considered non-deviant and non-perverse, and basically, as much as the word itself is problematic, normal. Because to me, being trans is normal. To not be trans or queer is to not be normal. Yeah, so in terms of the normalcy of it, I've always talked about it and treated it immediately as a very just basic part of life, when other people were very uncomfortable and confused and really actually angry and kind of violent about it, and luckily not more violent than they were. It was more of a just a lack of support than an actual attack. But so other people felt uncomfortable, and to me it was like, I'm trans, without going into tremendous detail about how I came out, what it felt like, how people took it, how my family took it. I don't care. It was just, as soon as I understood what trans could be, what it really could be, and that there were lots of people in the community who experienced physical and emotional things that were very, very similar to my own. Knowing that was so validating and real and true. It was just so easy. It was just so easy. It just suddenly everything made sense. And I had such an easier time coming out to myself as trans than I did coming out as a lesbian, which I did before that, and I came out as bi before that. Neither of those went well to me. I kind of broke down about it because I thought it was, at the time, some sort of internalized shame, but it really wasn't a shame thing. It was that it wasn't quite accurate. It just, there was something that wasn't true. It wasn't true. And I remember when I was coming out as lesbian, I was like, I fought it so hard. I was like, no, this is not true. I wasn't sure if it was the word lesbian I didn't like. It's kind of a weird word. It just didn't fit right. And everyone wanted me to be something that I wasn't. I started to present a little bit more masculine, which was acceptable in the lesbian community, as long as you're still a lesbian, as long as you're still a girl at the time. And, so I started having this sort of boy-girl look going on, and people thought that I was butch, or they called me baby dyke and things like that. And I was like, there's something not right about those either. I'm not butch. In fact, I was never ever butch. My masculine identity never had anything to do with butchness. So that wasn't right. It wasn't right, and I fought it, and, when I realized I wasn't a masculine girl. I was a boy. In fact, a very feminine boy. So if you're kind of looking at gender as a spectrum, if you have hyper masculine, hyper feminine on one side, and you have like kind of a gender neutral in the middle, and you've got like a masculine femininity and a feminine masculinity. I was more on the feminine masculinity ballpark. So it just made so much sense. It was very easy, and part of what made it livable was knowing that there were other guys. And I don't know if I could have done it when I did if it were not for other guys who had websites. I was in college at the time, and there were other college-age guys just sort of, blogging about going to class and going to homecoming and whatever. And they were guys, and they talked about how did they come out to their professors and what were the projects they were doing and the papers they were writing, and I knew that you could do it, and you didn't have to be secretive, and you didn't have to just do it in your room, like cross-dress in your room and not ever tell anybody and like live a secret life. And like I said earlier, that's what makes me historically relevant. The history of the trans community is a private and a secret one, and there's plenty and plenty of trans people who still have double lives, or they are stealth, which means they transition and then they're not out as trans afterwards. They just sort of blend in with the cisgender communities, and I'm not devaluing that. It's just a different way of identifying and living. It's not how I feel comfortable, but now you can sometimes, not always, sometimes it's a safety issue, but sometimes you can choose to be out or not. And there was a time, there was a lot of centuries when it was impossible and just sort of not in the vernacular, and then it was possible but considered freakish, and so was very much a private thing, and sometimes still emerges in media as a sensational freak story or a joke. It's not funny. Yeah, so coming out as trans was just very easy. It was just easy because it made sense. And everything just felt right and fell into place. And I don't want to say that everything needs to fit nicely into its little box and with nothing left over when you close it. That's kind of what queerness is about the diversity of and the fluidities of the identities. And that it can change day to day, minute to minute. How you're perceived by other people varies, or how I'm perceived by other people based on who I'm standing next to. If I'm surrounded by gay men, I'm assumed to be a gay man. So I don't want to say that things have to fit concisely into their slots, but sometimes a name makes sense, and sometimes a pronoun makes sense. And another way that I'm part of queer history is that I'm trying to revolutionize trans representation on stage. like I said, there's a tremendous history of characters in drama who display transgender characteristics, but are not necessarily actually trans identified. And something that I write about a lot is queer and trans spectatorship, which just means how we look at these characters and recognize them as our community, and yet they're not. They're not. We claim them. So as a revisionist, I grab them and I flip them back out in the way that we see them, or at least the way that I see them. So that's one thing that I do with classical dramatic texts. But I also write characters who are trans and who are complex individuals, who are more than just their gender identity. I think we're reduced to our gender identity quite a lot, in fact more so than cisgender people. It's like the coming out thing. It's like straight people don't have to come out, cisgender people don't have to come out. I mean, it's like, have you ever tried to not be the gender that was assigned to you at birth? Like, why does that feel right for you? Because that seems the opposite of normal to me. So I write characters who have that experience, but their stories are not about their gender identity. I mean, how many stories can you tell about somebody's gender? I don't think that's very interesting, you know. I just really don't. So I like to tell stories. I like to tell stories about trans guys who are very set in their identity. So they've already sort of figured out they're who they are. They're adults, and they have complicated relationships like other people. You know, because I mean, we do more than come out. We do more than transition or not transition. We're more than public bathroom and locker room incidents. We date. We have families and chosen families, and we get married, or we don't. We have fights. You know, we get sick. We get sad for non-trans reasons. That we have identities that cross over with other identities. You know, there's a whole community of trans people of color. There's a community of trans people of color with disability. You know, I mean, there's very focused communities, but there's also layers and layers on top of themselves. You know, and that is interesting to me, and I'm ready to see stories that I recognize from my life on stage, and because it hasn't happened yet, I am going to be part of making that happen.